So I wanted to share the surprising results of my ancestry DNA test. I took two ancestry tests, one through African Ancestry and one through Ancestry.com. The African Ancestry traced me to a particular tribe or a particular ethnic group in Cameroon, and I took the second test through Ancestry because I wanted an overall genetic makeup. And I also thought it was kind of cool that you could match people and kind of like piece together parts of your family you don't know about. So I took the ancestry test and I got the results last year. I really didn't know how to, I know it sounds stupid, but I really didn't know how to interpret the results that I received. Um, I could see, like, I matched with people, but I didn't really know too much more than that. And I wasn't really very impressed with the test results because most of the people were like distant or like it just seemed like they were kind of far away. So I wasn't really that impressed by the results until recently. I started spending a little bit more time with it. I started communicating with people off the website, and there was one I started with named Kevin. He wasn't the first that I communicated with, but he was the first one that gave me some substantial information about our family. We ended up learning that both of our great grandparents were siblings. My great grandmother Eliza and his great grandfather Jeff were brother and sister, and I had never heard of Kevin, so that was exciting. I continued to review the results, and eventually I was like curious about who my biological great grandfather on my maternal side was for both my mother's mother and my mother's father. And so I started looking through the results, trying to determine which side of the family that people, I guess, will fall under. And it was easy because my father took the DNA test, and my father's matches and my matches with my father all say paternal. So now I have just maternal, but I have to figure out if the maternal matches my mother's mother or my mother's father. I was able to do that. And so one of the family names on that side that I've always heard of, that I'm familiar with, is Chubb, Chubb. And the story was always that my great grandmother's sister married into that family, and that's how there was some relation. Now, that didn't really quite make sense. I'm a very analytical person, so I analyze the heck out of everything. So, the first thing I thought of that explanation is, well, wouldn't that make us only related to her and her husband's offspring? We wouldn't necessarily be related to the whole family because we're only related to the family through her marrying one of them, and then their offspring would be our relatives. Okay. So that never really made sense to me, but that's a name that I was familiar with on that side of the family. So back to my results. As I'm searching through my results, I keep seeing the name Chubb on people's family trees. And so that was a little frustrating to me because every time I would open it, I would understand that that means that that's related to my mother's maternal grandmother side of the family through the marriage of her sister. And so when I would open it and see that, I'm like, they have a million people. They have a million people in this family. Like, how did her and her husband produce so many different people? But whatever. I didn't have time to really think about it. I just, every time I would open someone's page, and even if they didn't have that last name, if they had that on their family tree, I automatically closed it because I'm looking for my grandmother's biological father's family who should have a different last name. I'm looking for any other last name that I've never heard of, that I've never known, because we didn't know her biological great grandfather. So in the interim, I end up emailing with a young lady named LaRhonda. Shout out to LaRhonda and Kevin both, because you were both very helpful and instrumental with helping me to learn the information that I learned. LaRhonda was very nice, and she responded right away. And we started talking and we got to talking about our great grandmothers, and she said she had a great grandmother named Eliza, which is my great grandmother's name. So I'm like, oh, okay, Eliza blank, which is my biological great grandmother. And she's like, no, Eliza Chubb and Elizabeth blank. I don't want to give out her other great grandmother's last name. So I was a little confused because I'm thinking like, well, what does either of those names have to do with me? And then I'm like, well, did my great grandmother go by Eliza Chubb? I'm like, no, she never went by that. So I was like, well, do you know how we're related? And she's like, well, let me check with my mom. So she checked with her mom and she got back with me. I think it was a few hours later. And she said, my mother said, you're related to me through blank Chubb. She said a first name. I'm not going to put it in this video because I feel it's still a little controversial, even though it is what it is. So when she said the name, I was a little taken aback because that was my great grandmother's sister's husband. Again, anytime anyone says that we're related to the family, the Chubb family, they would always say through great grandmother's sister. And my argument was that, okay, that would make us related to their offspring, but not their whole entire family. So when she told me the person's name, I was like skeptical and I thought maybe the information was incorrect. So I just thanked her and I closed out of her message and I just continued looking for the next couple of weeks, trying to find out the identity of my biological maternal grandmother's father. So my um, great grandfather. So I kept looking, kept looking, kept looking. And so in the interim, I found a picture of my great grandmother's sister. Her name was Mary Alice. And I sent it to my mother and I said, do you know her? Are you familiar with her? And she recognized her. She's like, yeah. So then I sent a picture of her husband. And I wasn't trying to bait my mother or anything. At this point, I'm still thinking like, this is her husband. That's it. Nothing to do with us. So I send it to my mother and my mother looks at it and we're texting. My mother texts back. She's like, he looks like Uncle Charles. Now, Uncle Charles is my grandmother's brother. So I look at the picture and I can't really see it because Uncle Charles was probably almost 50 when I was born. So I never knew him as a very young man, but my mother did. So I guess my mother is looking at the picture of him young and seeing my Uncle Charles as a young man in him. So I'm like, So I keep looking at the picture and I do see what I kind of felt was a little similarity between him and my grandmother. So I put the pictures side by side and I compare them. And to me, they have like similar eyes. They have similar shaped eyebrows. They have a similar nose. And she's smiling, but he's not. So the mouth I couldn't tell. But my mother, after I put a collage of them together and sent it to my mother, I said, look how much they favor your mother and her uncle through marriage. And so my mother's like, yeah, I see it. She's like, even down to the mouth. Again, I couldn't see the mouth because their mouths were in two different positions, but I would expect my mother to know what her mother's mouth looked like. She looked at her mouth her whole life. So when my mother said she noticed that he looked like Uncle Charles, I noticed that he looked like my grandmother. I went back to the young lady's message, LaRhonda, and I read it again, and it says, "My mother says you're related to us through blank Chubb." And I when I read it that time, it hit me differently. She meant specifically through him and not through marriage. She meant you literally are related to me as a result of being related to him, not related to me because of his kids, but you're related to me through him. Now, I know that's dumb and I should have known in the first place what she was saying, but I just couldn't fathom it. If you knew my great grandmother, like I could not see her like, when I knew her, she was a Bible thumping, you going to hell, Church of God in Christ. Like that's the great grandmother I knew. I didn't know the young, hip, out here pulling men. I didn't know that grandma. So I decided at this point to pay for a subscription to Ancestry so that I could review census records, marriage licenses, and all that. And I paid and I began to put in the time and effort looking at people's family trees. And what I started noticing is that not only was I related to my aunt's offspring and, the great grandkids or grandkids, I'm sorry, grandkids, I was also related to her husband's brothers and sisters, grandkids and great grandkids. So I'm like, oh my gosh. Now, one thing I had to do is because they come from a very small town, I had to make sure that these people weren't related to my great grandmother's side of the family. Okay. So, because the families intertwined a lot. So I had to go through the trees carefully just to see who was related to my great grandmother's side versus who was specifically related to my grand aunt's husband's side. And in fact, I matched to about 4 or 5 of my grand aunt's husband's brothers and sisters, like the grandkids and great great grandkids and the great 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 grand. So at this point, it was very clear to me that my grandmother was the biological daughter of her aunt's husband. And that kind of like blew me away because that's not something I ever fathomed. And it's not something I expected to see. It's not something that ever occurred to me. I'm going in there every day looking for a part of the family that I don't know. And also, they should be like closer DNA wise. And I'm not seeing anything but this Chubb family. I won't say anything, but for the most part, I'm seeing a lot of people who tie back to that family. So now that I pay for the subscription, I decide, okay, let me go back and look and see if I can find marriage licenses because I couldn't find birth certificates. I even tried looking for my mother, who I know has a birth certificate, and I couldn't find it on that site. So I go look at marriage licenses, and I see, and this is another shocking thing, I see that this man, there's a marriage license between him and my great grandmother's oldest sister, Sarah. And it looks like Sarah transitioned or passed away in 1937. And then in 1941, it looks like there's a marriage license between this man and my great grandmother's youngest sister, Mary Alice. So I go back and I do the math, and the first thing I looked at was the census records. I wanted to see the ages or the age difference between the sisters. So it looks like the sister that he married that passed away in 1937, she was older than my great grandmother. And then the younger sister was 10 years younger than my great grandmother. So the timeline goes like this. My great grandmother had my grandmother in 1925. She had my grand uncle in 1927 or 1928. And then it looks like he married her sister around 1931, her older sister. And then she transitioned in 1937. And then he married her younger sister in 1941. And it looks like they had about 6 or 7 kids. Our entire lives, that was a secret. Now, it wasn't a secret to everyone because people knew, including the person that was providing LaRhonda with this information. And I think some of my family even knew based on discussions I've had with some of my cousins, my older cousins. I don't know why this information was withheld from us. I'm not even sure if my grandmother knew the truth or my uncle knew the truth, and they just ignored this man. He didn't transition until my mother was in high school, but my mother said she never knew him. So it was clear that it was, I don't know if it was a shameful act or I don't know why. I don't know why it was not discussed and why it was a secret. Even today, some of my, like one of my aunts wanted us to drop it. She didn't want us talking about it. And I don't quite understand why not. So now, I feel very pleased to have this information. It was a little bit of a challenge for me. Had I paid for this subscription earlier, I probably would have learned earlier. I went back to LaRhonda and I asked her, I said, LaRhonda, can you tell me if blank is the father to my grandmother? And she wrote me back a few days later and she said, yes, blank is your grandmother's biological father, which I already knew. I match all his family. So, they're supposedly having a family reunion next year, and I don't really feel comfortable. I know I'm related to them, but older people don't probably understand genetics, and it's kind of embarrassing because we were, to me, not that they said it, but to me, the illegitimate kids. Because otherwise, why would we a secret? Why was my grandmother and her brother a secret? I feel like we are the illegitimate people, even though my grandmother was born before he married my great grandmother's sisters. Um, I feel like we were the dirty secret. So I think I'm just good having the information and knowing where I come from. Chubbtown, where the people are from, it has an amazing history. It has an amazing history. And I love history. So I think for me, just knowing that I come from people, even though we were illegitimate, it's still in the DNA, baby. But just knowing that I come from such a resilient group of people. They established their town 1 year before slavery was abolished. I can't wait to read this book. I just got it over the weekend, so I can't wait to read it because I want to know how freed slaves were able to travel through states and establish a town, a well organized town with lots of different professions. I'm still proud to know that I come from this group of individuals who not only had to be physically, mentally strong, they had to be just an extraordinary group of people. And that makes me happy. So I'm pleased with that. But yes, my great grandmother and her sisters were all with the same man. And it's nothing to feel shameful about, one of my friends says, because I guess there was limited access to, or no access really at that time, to vehicles. So they were with whoever was closest. And it wasn't viewed as nasty back then. I'm not viewing it as nasty now. I'm just more so shocked that this was the story and this was the father of her kids. That was the most shocking thing for me because my whole life it was always, oh, Grand Liza's sister married into that family, and in fact that was not the truth of the matter. They left out a huge part of that story, and I happened to uncover it with DNA testing. So it's interesting because back in my grandmother was born in 1925. I'm sure almost 100 years ago they did not think that this information would ever come out. They probably couldn't even fathom DNA testing. Just like 100 years from today, I don't know what they'll be able to pull from DNA. They may be able to pull that you smoked a joint when you were 17, or they may be able to pull that your great 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 grandmother had sex with 40 men, or I don't know what they'll be able to pull in the future, but it's something I can't even fathom. So anyway, that is my story. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.